Testing, testing. All right. Sorry I'm late. Was changing a diaper. Anybody else in here gone from changing a diaper to teaching Bible class? All right. Let me get my thoughts together. Good to see everyone this morning. We'll be in Matthew 5. You have your Bible. Until the new quarter starts, which I believe is April, so a couple weeks away, we're going to be thinking about prayer and just some specific aspects of prayer, just some things that maybe we don't think about often, or maybe we do. But last Sunday, started talking about and thinking about how Jesus instructed his followers to pray for their enemies. Pray for their enemies. Something that is a little bit, maybe not even a little bit, maybe a lot radical than what they had heard in the first century and even still today. It's not the way that we tend to think. Our nature, we don't tend to want to do good to those who harm us or hate us or persecute us. It's almost human nature to want to feel a certain way, react a certain way, get even, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Someone does something to us, it eats us up inside, and we spend a lot of our time dwelling on it and thinking about maybe how to get even, or we live in a world where revenge, that kind of mindset and thinking. So what Jesus teaches his followers there and in the first century and here today is to pray for those who are your enemies. And they can be your enemy on a scale of, just someone that doesn't look at you favorably, someone that doesn't maybe like you. And there's people out there that are like that, and you're on their bad list. And that scale can go all the way up to maybe not in this country, maybe not yet, but in other parts of the world where Christians have true enemies, where their life is threatened. They have to worship in secret. China being one of those, where it's illegal in the country to even own a Bible. The church there worships in secret, underground. I remember in preaching school, one of my instructors, Billy Bland, he was telling us then, I don't know if he still does it, he may, but he used to take mission trips to China, go over to China, and he would have to apply for a green card or a visa or something. He had to apply for something, and you have to tell China why you're coming over there. And they really look deep into, all the details. Why are you coming here? What are you doing? And they go over there to teach English, basically. So they're going to teach. And while they're there, they use the Bible to teach and work with the church underground. But I remember distinctly that on one occasion while I was in preaching school, he was trying to fill out all the paperwork and get his application or whatever he needed to go over to China. And China suspected something suspicious. And he was telling us this in class, that there was a detail that China didn't like about his application, and so they would not approve it. And so for a little while, he couldn't go over there. And so we live maybe in a country where our freedoms are certainly a blessing, and we don't experience what a lot of other Christians in the world experience as far as true enemies, people that really will harm them, governments that will harm and persecute in the name of Christianity. And so, whatever the scale is, I don't think it really matters. I think the application and the lesson is the same, to pray for your enemies. We left off last Sunday. We worked our way through different introductory thoughts and points. And in Matthew 5, we left off with the thought that Jesus says in verse 43, "You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy." The second part of that, the latter part of that, does not sound like anything that God would and had ever commanded. Nowhere did God ever say to hate your enemy. This would have been an addition by the religious leaders, the Pharisees of that day. That would have been more along their mindset, to teach the people to love your enemies or to love your neighbors and to hate your enemy. And so what Jesus is doing in the Sermon on the Mount is he's taking, you've heard it said this way, but I tell you this, so he's turning it on its head. You've heard this maybe all of your life, maybe since a child, who knows? Those in the range of Jesus listening to his teaching, who knows how long they've heard it. Jesus says, you've heard it said, love your neighbor, hate your enemy. Jesus says, but I tell you. And he's going to turn it over on its head and tell them something that they've never really thought about or considered. And in that day, especially, because there were religious and political parties that hated each other. The Pharisees hated the Sadducees. The Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Herodians hated the Pharisees hated the Herodians. The Herodians supported King Herod and his dynasty. The Pharisees did not. The Herodians supported, or at least tolerated, Roman rule. The Pharisees did not. And so you have these groups and political parties, religious parties, that hated each other. And so in the midst of all of that, Jesus comes in and he teaches something so radically different. I'll point it out one more time, and then we'll jump to some examples. But if you go to the very end of Matthew 7, this would be the conclusion of the Sermon on the Mount. He's finishing up his Sermon on the Mount, everything that he has discussed, Matthew 5, 6, 7, when he finishes everything. Verse 28, and so it was when Jesus had ended these sayings that the people were astonished at his teaching. For he taught them as one having authority, and he did. Matthew 28, 18 through 20, Jesus says, all authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. And so he no doubt had the authority, but he spoke as one having authority. And the people were astonished and marveled. This is one example, Matthew 7:28. That's one example of other passages where the people marveled at his teaching. He's teaching things they've never heard, never even considered this. And the multitudes followed. And so again, we left off thinking about what Jesus preached. And a bulk of that coming from Matthew chapter 5 here, in verse 43. What he preached. And in just a moment, we'll consider how he lived what he preached. He practiced what he preached. And we still use that phrase today, to practice what you preach. As a preacher, I'm very careful and mindful of that, but just as a Christian, I hope we're all mindful of that, to practice what you preach. And oftentimes the world sees the hypocrisy in the moment when we don't practice what we preach, when we live in a way and act in a way and behave in a way that doesn't align with Christian principles. And they see that we're not really practicing what we're preaching. And it's obvious. Oftentimes the world sees it, the church can see it. You know, if you live one way in the church, and then we can see you outside these walls, and you're not practicing, so to speak, what you preach as a Christian. But in a moment, we'll consider how Jesus practiced what he preached. Think again, and this is where we ended our class, the word agape. So when Jesus says to love your enemies, that word love there is agape. Again, one more time, consider the word agape. Agape is where you have the best interest of someone else in your mind. You want the best thing to happen to them, their best interest. And in the moment, in the context of what we're talking about, what we truly want for our enemies is that they repent, obey the gospel, and are saved. That is agape love. To want the best for them. I don't have to like what they're doing. I don't have to feel any kind of other types of love that we might talk about. But the love that Jesus refers to in Matthew 5:43 and following, to love your enemies, verse 44, but I say to you, love your enemies. That's agape love. To do good to them. To take the high road, I guess we sometimes say today. If they slap you on one cheek, turn to them the other instead of giving it back. What good does that do? To treat them the way that they treated you, to love them. And we see that in the verbs. Notice verse 44. Notice the verbs. But I say to you, love your enemies, right? Agape love. Bless those who curse you. Bless. That's good towards them. Blessing them. Do good to those who hate you. Do good. Do good. Do something good. Notice the action here. And pray. That's probably the best thing that you can do for those who spitefully persecute you. And so notice those verbs, those action words there, to bless, do good, and to pray. But then Jesus assigns 3 motives. Why would I as a Christian want to do that? Well, first of all, you should want to do it because the Lord instructed to do so. But he doesn't end there. He doesn't just say, do it because I say so. He connects it with 3 motives. Number 1 in verse 45. When he says all this, to love your enemies, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, pray for those who spitefully use you. Verse 45 is a continuation of the sentence. That you may be sons of your Father in heaven. For he makes the sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the just and the unjust. And so motive number 1, when we behave this way, or when we learn to live this way, or let me say it this way, when we learn to love this way, when we learn to extend love to our enemies, number 1, we will be like our Father who is in heaven, that you may be sons. Some translations say children. That you may be children of your Father. And then we see the example that he sets. He allows the rain and the sun to rise and to fall on the good and the evil. He doesn't show partiality to those that are good. The rain falls on the garden of the evil and the good. So when we learn to do the same, to love our enemies, we become children of our Father, like our Father. Number 2, verse 46. Those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? Now, put yourself in the first century mindset, how that application of a tax collector would affect them as they are listening. They very much hated tax collectors, and for reasons, because tax collectors were often crooked, and they overcharged, and then they kept the additional, and they became wealthy over it. In fact, when you go and read, I think Luke 19, I think I'm right, or Matthew 19, when Jesus and Zacchaeus, and Jesus goes to Zacchaeus' his house. Zacchaeus, after spending time with the Lord, says, I will give back fourfold, I believe fourfold, of anything that I've taken. Oftentimes hated for becoming wealthy off of the common citizen. But Jesus says, do not the tax collectors do the same? And so what difference are you doing? You're no different if you do the same. But then he continues on, verse 47, and if you greet your brethren only, what do you do more than others? Do not even the tax collectors do so? So if you behave like the world, you're no different than the world. Because this is the way the world behaves. They greet their own and they love their own. And if you only love those that are good to you, what difference is there? And you are certainly, as a follower of Christ, called to be different. So motive number 3, to be called out, to live different than the world. But then number 3, verse 48, another motive, therefore you shall be perfect. That word perfect meaning whole or complete. And we only find that in Christ. I'm not perfectly sinless, but I can be complete, mature in my Christian life as I learn to love those who hate me, my enemies. There's a lot of growth that takes place when I, as a Christian, as a person, learn how to control my emotions and to truly bless and pray for those that are my enemies. Like, there's a lot of spiritual growth there, and a lot of fruit is produced when we do. But verse 48, therefore you shall be perfect, complete, just as your Father in heaven is perfect. All right, let's think about what Jesus practiced. So we see what he preached, Matthew 5:43, one of the main texts. But let's notice what he practiced. In Luke chapter 9, let's consider an event. In Luke chapter 9, as Jesus is preparing himself to go to Jerusalem, Jesus knew this day was coming. Obviously, just read the Gospels, any Gospel. Read all 4 Gospels. Notice all of the times that Jesus refers to his death. He knows it's coming. He dies. He's crucified around 33 years old. We know and understand. 33. I mean, I'm 37 this year. And I can't wrap my mind around some of the details. 33. But he knew the day's coming. And just listen to all the times that he talks about it and references his dying. The times that he talks about tearing the temple down and building it up in 3 days. That's his death. That's his crucifixion. The temple, his body. Whenever he's, Matthew 17, when he's on the Mount of the Transfiguration, and he's transfigured there. And he's there with Moses and Elijah. What they talk about among the 3 of them is his exodus or his death. When Jesus talks about his death on one occasion, Peter says, not so, Lord, not if I have anything to do with it. I'm not going to allow you to die. And that's the moment when Jesus said, get behind me, Satan. because I must go to Jerusalem and I must die. He knew it was coming. And so with that in mind, when we go to Luke chapter 9 and verse 51, now it came to pass when the time had come for him to be received up, the time's there. It's right there. It's happening. When the time had come, that he steadfastly set his face to go to Jerusalem. That's Luke's way of saying that he prepared himself. And he turns to Jerusalem and he knows what is about to play out and how he's ultimately about to be betrayed, arrested, tried, and crucified. The moment is here. The Samaritans, the unfriendly Samaritans here, they do not welcome him. Verse 52, he turned his face to Jerusalem, verse 52, and sent messengers before his face, and as they went, they entered a village of the Samaritans to prepare for him. Verse 53, but they did not receive him, because his face was set for the journey to Jerusalem. And so here is a moment as it's close that the Lord's going to die. He's ready to make those preparations, and he's ready to do what needs to be done. And he goes to Jerusalem, or he sets his face to Jerusalem, and they go into this Samaritan village. And the Samaritans do not welcome Jesus. They don't receive him. And so question, and if you've read further, you know where we're going with this. Question, if you're there with Jesus, let's just say you're one of the disciples or apostles. You're there with Jesus, and you see this group of people not receive your master, your leader. He's rejected by these people. How would you feel? What would you do? How would you react? You'd probably take it pretty personal. You'd be emotional in the moment. Say things, think things, as we see his apostles do. Notice verse 54. And when his disciples, James and John, saw this, they said, Lord, do you want us to command fire to come down from heaven and consume them just as Elijah did? Are you picturing that in your mind? So here's a moment where Jesus is not received, not welcomed, really. He's rejected. And that's ultimately why he's crucified, because a lot of people, at least the Jews, the Pharisees, he was rejected. Isaiah even prophesied that. Isaiah 53, that he was despised and rejected. So we know that's ultimately a fulfillment of prophecy. But here in the moment, the Samaritans reject, or at least they just don't receive him. And so James and John, they see this, and their humanistic thought is, should we call down fire from heaven and consume them? I don't know if that's technically revenge or getting even, but it's typically how we want to respond to something of that nature. And so then we notice the Lord's response. Verse 55, to them, his disciples, and said, you do not know what manner of spirit you are of. For the Son of Man did not come to destroy men's lives, but to save them. And they went to another village. So here in Luke 9, we've already considered what the Lord preached. Love your enemies. And Jesus had many enemies. But here in Luke chapter 9 is a situation where he's preparing to go to Jerusalem, and to do so, he goes to a particular Samaritan village. He's not received. James and John respond by asking Jesus, should we call down fire from heaven and consume them? And Jesus rebukes James and John and says that I did not come to destroy lives, but to save them. If I were you, in my Bible or my notes or just in the thoughts of my mind, I would connect that with well, I got the first reference wrong. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save that which was lost. What reference is that? I thought it was Luke 19:11, but that's not it. Luke 19:10. I was one verse off. Luke 19:10. I would connect that in your mind, your notes. The Son of Man has come to seek and to save that which was lost. And that's the context of Zacchaeus. As Jesus entered into the presence of Jericho, Luke 19:1, he went into Jericho. Now behold, there was a man named Zacchaeus who was a chief tax collector, and he was rich. The Bible tells us he was rich. Well, how did he get rich? Well, I can only assume. And he sought to see who Jesus was. He climbs a sycamore tree. He goes to his house. Jesus goes to his house. Verse 8, we already referenced what Zacchaeus said. Then Zacchaeus stood and said to the Lord, look, Lord, I give half of my goods to the poor, and if I have taken anything from anyone by false accusation, I restore fourfold. Then verse 10, for the Son of Man came to seek and to save that which was lost. And going back to Luke 9, verse 56, I didn't come to destroy lives, but to save them. And then simply they went to another village. And so he wasn't received here in this village, so they turn and they just go to another village. Kind of the same concept when Jesus sent out the disciples, the apostles, to the limited commission. And if they are rejected, if they are not welcomed or received, that principle of just dust your feet off and go somewhere else. So Jesus isn't going to do anything here in the moment. They just simply go to another village. Hey. Hey. That's a good thought. Let's turn there. John 3. John 3. Let's say a couple of things. Yeah, I would connect this in your mind, your thoughts too. Just for a moment. John 3. Now, anytime you talk about John 3:16, you have to keep it in its context. He's talking to Nicodemus. The whole Nicodemus scenario, coming to Jesus by night. And Jesus says, you must be born again. Their conversation. And Nicodemus says, well, how can a man be born again? Can he enter into, again, his mother's womb? So in that whole context of the new birth, right? Because a lot of people like to go to John 3:16. See, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life. Yes, but 10 or so verses earlier, he just talked about the new birth. It's right there in the context. So John 3:16, for God so loved the world, certainly, yes, that he gave his only begotten Son. Verse 17, Mitch pointed out, for God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, A little bit different than Luke 9, condemn, but uh, same ideas here, that he came to save the world, not condemn. Because there's really two ways of looking at the death of Jesus. There's two ways. For us in this room, we see that he came to save us. And we took advantage of that. And we obeyed the gospel. We've been baptized for the remission of our sins. And if I were to ask you any question about that, what did Jesus do on the cross? Well, he came to save me. We understand that. But then there's some in the world who are not Christians that when they learn about Christianity, maybe their thought is, so you're telling me that God's going to send me to hell? Me, a good person, God's going to send me to hell? Well, no. Sin will. And I believe that's why John 3:17 is there. Because God did not come into the world to condemn it. God's going to send me to hell? No. Nope. You're looking at it all wrong. You're looking at it upside down if that's the way you're looking at it. He did not come to condemn you, and he doesn't condemn you. He will condemn sin. And if you have sin, which we all do, Romans 3:23, and the wages of sin is death, Romans 6:23, he did not come into the world to condemn it, but that the world through him might be saved. So you can either look at the death of Jesus as he came to save me, or you can look at it as he came to condemn me in the fact that you're telling me that God would send me to hell if I don't obey him. Well, you can look at it that way, or you can just obey because he came to save you, and sin will condemn you. But we go back to Luke chapter 9. Well, we're actually going to leave Luke chapter 9, but connected to Luke 9, the statement there by the Lord that he came to save. John 3:16-17, and Matthew or Luke 19:10. Okay, so let's transition for just a moment. Got about 10 minutes left. Let's go to Matthew chapter 26. We're looking at what Jesus practiced. We've seen what, he preached, love your enemies, now his practice. Luke 9 is a great example. Especially we see how his disciples reacted in the moment and how Jesus was cool, calm, and collected, and he did not destroy them like the disciples wanted, and they just went to another city. But another one that is a little bit more familiar to us is Matthew 26, as Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he's wrestling with himself. He's, in Luke 9, it says that he set his face to Jerusalem, meaning that he's prepared to make that journey. But now he's there. It's the night of. It's Friday night. And early in the morning, he's about to be arrested, and he's wrestling with himself, his emotions. He's praying there with some of his disciples. They're falling asleep. And 3 times, Jesus goes off into the distance and there prays. And he prays the prayer, Father, let this cup pass from me, not my will, but yours be done, right? He's in the garden, he's praying. He comes to this moment, I guess, where maybe he's I don't know the word for it. He's prepared, he's prayed, he's prepared, and they come to arrest him there in the garden, beginning in verse 47 for our thoughts. And while he was still speaking, all right, well, let's back up a little bit. Verse 42, just looking down, but again, the second time he went away and prayed, saying, Father, if this cup cannot pass away from me unless I drink it, your will be done. And he came and found them asleep again, for their eyes were heavy. So he left them and went away again and prayed a third time, saying some words. Then he came to his disciples and said, Are you still sleeping and resting? Behold, the hour is at hand. The Son of Man is being betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let's go. See, my betrayer is at hand. So there's this moment in the garden where he's prayed and he kind of comes to this like resolution, or he comes to this peace, maybe a moment of peace, because one of the gospels, I can't remember which one, I don't think it's Matthew, but Mark or Luke or John, tells us that an angel came and strengthened him. So there's this moment where Jesus is like, okay, it's time to go. And he goes to his disciples, let's go. It's here. And so they take him and they arrest him. How does Peter react? He drew a sword. He drew a sword. He's ready to fight. Okay? Yes, ma'am. Okay. Yeah. Mm-hmm. 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 Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. That's true. No, yeah, yeah. So, hey, great comments, and it's oftentimes difficult for us to comprehend how someone like Jesus can be 100% God and 100% man, because we're only 100% man. So how can he be both? And so it's hard to understand that, but we do believe it, even though sometimes we're like, how does that happen? Well, we don't understand that. However, he was 100% man. And so everything that he endured on the cross from a physical standpoint, I mean, you have to give it to the Romans as well. The Romans perfected what they did. It wasn't just some measly little torture where, he had to walk barefoot on some Legos, right? You know, they perfected perfected. Yeah. They knew exactly where your nerve endings were to cause the most pain. And so, from a physical standpoint, I mean, he was scourged, and the practice, and I've heard a lot of different teachings on scourging, different thoughts, and no doubt it has changed throughout the years. It has changed and looked different with different groups of people. But with the Romans, one of the things that I understand is that when they scourge you, they would take you to a scourging block and tie you down. And they would scourge you until both lungs from your backside were exposed, meaning enough flesh was ripped off that they could see your lungs. And that's when they stopped. Most people besides Jesus, I would say all but Jesus, died on the scourging block. And so when the Romans scourged someone, they died there. But Jesus did not. And he makes his way all the way to, and Pilate, I believe, even thought that that would be enough. Like, we're done. This is good enough. And Pilate said, well, what should we do? And that's when the Jews were like, crucify. So they're not satisfied with that. Take him and kill him. And then the crown of thorns that they put on his head. Men, you ever cut your face shaving? You ever just a little nick and it just won't stop bleeding? Just won't stop bleeding? Or Kessler, now he's hitting his head a lot, doing things, he'll get on something, he'll get on these pews and be like, Dad, watch this. And they'll jump off. And, he'll nick his head and he'll bleed, and it just bleeds and bleeds and bleeds and bleeds, right? You've got more blood vessels in your head than anywhere else. So, they put the crown of thorns on him. He lost so much blood and then he gets to the cross and everything that happens at the cross. And so physically, yeah, absolutely. It was torture and then death. Everyone that was crucified, they died by asphyxiation. They die from suffocation. So when you're suspended with your arms and you're hanging in that position, you can't breathe because there's too much weight on your lungs. And so anytime he spoke, he said 7 things from the cross. Anytime he could speak, he had to pull himself up. And then all the nerve endings. And so the Romans, and again, you got to give it to them in the sense that they knew what they were doing to torture a man. And so when the physical Jesus looked at the cross, of course he doesn't want to go through that, even knowing the outcome, right? But he does because of love. And we're at our time, so I'm not going to, but we got a couple more comments. Yeah. Yeah, there you go. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Sure. Okay. Yeah. Yes. Absolutely. Good example. And I don't want to start here next Sunday, so let me just go ahead and say this as we end. Peter in the garden cutting off the ear, and Jesus restores it. That's the example we were going to look at and consider, Matthew 26. And then the third and final example, Jesus on the cross, and he makes the statement, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And I think that statement is ultimately played out on the day of Pentecost. And those that were there crucifying Jesus and their sins were forgiven, even in the church. And so, Father, forgive them. They will be forgiven in the church. And so, even on the cross, Jesus praying for his enemies. And so, we see what he preached and we see what he practiced. Thanks for being here. Appreciate the comments. And you're dismissed.